Your child is crying in the middle of the night, and you are exhausted. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you wonder how anyone survived this before formula, before pediatricians, before baby monitors. The honest answer is that most of them did not. For most of human history, roughly half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Not from neglect, not from indifference. The prehistoric world was genuinely, relentlessly hostile to small bodies, and your ancestors knew this with a clarity that modern parents rarely have to face, and yet humanity did not vanish. So how did enough children survive, generation after generation, for you to be reading this right now? The answer is not luck. It is one of the most sophisticated survival systems your ancestors ever built, and almost none of it looked anything like modern parenting. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, who has spent decades studying the evolutionary biology of human child rearing, coined a term that reframed how researchers think about this entire question. She called it cooperative breeding. The idea is simple but radical. Human infants, unlike almost every other primate, were never raised by a single mother alone. They were raised by a network. This was not an emotional nicety, it was a biological necessity. Human babies are born extraordinarily helpless compared to other primates, and they stay that way for years. A chimpanzee infant can cling to its mother's fur within hours of birth. A human infant cannot even lift its own head for months. This is sometimes called the fourth trimester problem. The idea that human babies are essentially born too early because an adult-sized human head would not fit through the birth canal if gestation continued any longer. The result is an infant who requires an almost impossible amount of sustained care for an almost impossible length of time, and one mother working alone could never provide enough calories and protection to make that happen. So she did not work alone. Hrdy's research, drawing on extensive fieldwork among living hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Aka of Central Africa, found that infants in these societies were held by other people, what researchers call alloparents, for staggering amounts of time. In some studies, infants were passed to non-maternal caregivers, grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, unrelated group members, dozens of times a day. One often cited study of Aka infants found that babies were transferred between caregivers an average of over 8 times an hour during waking hours. Your ancestors did not raise children. Groups raised children. This distributed caregiving solved a problem that pure biology could not. If a mother fell ill, was injured during a hunt, or simply needed to sleep, the infant did not go uncared for. Someone else's body was already warm, already available, already invested in that child's survival. But warmth and attention were only the beginning. The deeper challenge was food, and this is where one of the most overlooked figures in human survival enters the story: the grandmother. The grandmother hypothesis, developed by researchers including Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah, proposes something that initially sounds strange. Human females are one of the only species on Earth that experience menopause, living for decades after their own reproductive window closes. Why would evolution preserve decades of life that cannot produce more offspring? The answer, according to Hawkes' extensive fieldwork with the Hadza, is that those grandmothers were directly responsible for keeping grandchildren alive. While younger mothers cared for newborns who require near constant attention, grandmothers gathered and processed food for older weaned children who could not yet forage efficiently on their own. Hawkes measured this directly. Hadza grandmothers contributed substantial caloric resources to their grandchildren, freeing mothers to have another child sooner, which meant more surviving children overall. A woman past her own reproductive years was not finished contributing to the next generation. She had simply changed roles, from producing children to ensuring the children already born would live to adulthood. This single shift may explain why humans, almost uniquely among mammals, live so long after our fertility ends. But knowledge mattered just as much as labor. Anthropologist Wiessner's decades of work among the hoansi people of the Kalahari revealed something crucial about how survival information actually moved through prehistoric communities. It was not transmitted through formal teaching, the way you might imagine a classroom. It moved through proximity. Children spent enormous amounts of time simply present, watching adults process food, treat wounds, identify which plants were edible and which were lethal. This mattered enormously because the natural world your ancestors lived in was full of invisible threats that a young child could not detect on their own. certain berries that looked identical to safe ones but caused organ failure, water sources that seemed clean but carried parasites. Without inherited, transmitted knowledge, a child's curiosity could become fatal within a single afternoon. The group's accumulated knowledge functioned as a kind of external immune system, protecting children from dangers their own instincts could not yet recognize. Let's reconstruct what an ordinary day actually looked like for a prehistoric toddler, somewhere in eastern Africa, perhaps 60,000 years ago. The child wakes pressed against an adult's body, already warm, already fed by proximity alone. There is no crib. There is no separate room. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, infants slept against a caregiver's skin, a practice anthropologists now call cosleeping, which regulated the infant's temperature and breathing far more precisely than any blanket could. Through the morning, the child is passed between 3 or 4 different adults and older children as tasks shift. An older sibling carries the toddler on a hip while gathering. A grandmother feeds the child mashed tubers while processing food for the rest of the group. When the child wanders too close to a termite mound or a thorned plant, someone, almost always someone, intervenes within seconds, because there are simply enough watching eyes that a child is rarely, if ever, truly alone. This constant supervision was not parental anxiety. It was structural redundancy, built directly into the architecture of how the group lived and moved. By afternoon, the child is old enough to begin small tasks, carrying a light bundle, helping crack open a nut, watching an older child demonstrate how to test if fruit is ripe. Learning happened constantly, almost invisibly, embedded inside ordinary group life rather than set apart from it. This is strikingly different from how most children grow up today, often isolated within a single household, dependent on 1 or 2 adults for nearly everything. There is a final piece to this puzzle that is easy to overlook. Physical proximity to danger was managed collectively too. Predators, falls, fire, and disease were constant threats, and prehistoric groups developed something researchers now describe as alarm-calling systems. A single sighting of a predator triggered an immediate group-wide response. Children swept up and moved to safety within moments, because the responsibility for any child's safety did not rest on one set of eyes. Anthropologist Barry Hewlett, who has spent decades studying the AKA and other Central African forager societies, documented something else worth noting. Fathers in these societies were often remarkably involved in direct infant care, holding, soothing, and carrying infants for substantial portions of the day, a pattern strikingly different from many assumptions about prehistoric gender roles. Care, in other words, was not assigned narrowly. It was distributed wherever capacity existed. None of this means prehistoric childhood was idyllic. Roughly half of all children still did not survive to adulthood, and the grief embedded in that statistic is almost impossible to fully comprehend from where you sit today. But the system your ancestors built was not failing. It was working against extraordinary odds, odds that would have been even higher without it. Every layer, cooperative breeding, grandmothers redirecting decades of labor toward grandchildren, knowledge transmitted through constant proximity, collective vigilance against danger, existed because no single strategy alone could have been enough. You are not descended from people who simply got lucky. You are descended from networks, from grandmothers who kept working long after they stopped having children of their own, from siblings who carried toddlers on their hips, from groups who watched each other's children as if the line between yours and mine barely existed, because in the deepest sense, it did not. The exhaustion you feel at 3 a.m, holding a crying child alone, is real, and it is also, in evolutionary terms, slightly unusual. For most of human history, you would not have been alone in that room. Your ancestors built an entire civilization out of refusing to let any single person carry that weight by themselves. That is how children actually survived. Not despite the village, because of it.